My name is Chris Washburn. I'm the chair of the music department, and I have the honor of making the introductions this evening. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I'll just go down the line here and introduce the speakers tonight. To my left is Michael Noon, is a professor in the Department of Music at Boston College. Noon's career as both a music scholar and a choral director has taken him to teaching, research, and performance posts at universities in 5 countries on 4 continents. He was educated at St. Ignatius College, Riverview, before going on to the University of Sydney and King's College, Cambridge. He served as the chair of musicology at the Australian National University School of Music and chair of music at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Michael. Next to Michael is Seth Kimmel, is Associate Professor of Early Modern Cultural Studies and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia University, as well as Director of Columbia's Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. His research focuses on the literatures and cultures of medieval and early modern Iberia, debates about religion and secularism, and the history of information management. His award-winning first book, Parables of Coercion, Conversion and Knowledge at the End of Islamic Spain, on University of Chicago Press in 2015, is an intellectual history of new Christian assimilation in the 16th century. Welcome, Seth. Next to Seth is my colleague, Giuseppe Gravino, and is a professor of music at Columbia University. His research interests include the Italian madrigal, the relationship between music and language in early modern period, early opera, and Renaissance theories of cognition and sense perception. He is the author of Canoni ad Enigmi, Pier Francesco's Valentini il L'artificio canonico nello primo metà del Seicento. Is that okay? Sorry about that. Ho abitato a Firenze molti anni fa. And Myth and the Music of Arcadia in Renaissance Italy, which won the 2010 Lewis Lockwood Award of the American Musicological Society. His publications have appeared in the Journal of Musicology, the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, the Musical Quarterly, Studi Musicali, and Il Saggiatore Musicale. Next to him is the woman and star of the evening. When asked to introduce her, I decided to print out her bio and realized that on the script today, it only said had 3 minutes, but this is going to take like 90 minutes because she is a truly remarkable scholar, one of the most productive scholar that I've ever met, and I'm so honored to be her colleague. We've been here almost the exact amount of time, the same time. We came in the same year, and it took me about 10 years to produce my first book, and she was already on her 8th. And anyway, I will give you a very brief description of her accolades, which doesn't even come close to capture the multifaceted and breadth that this scholar is able to master in so many ways and in so many languages. And unfortunately, some of these titles, hopefully, I edited them down so that I don't have to speak too many languages or butcher too many. So Susan Boynton is professor of music and director of the university seminars at Columbia University. Her research interests include liturgy and music in medieval Western monasticism, particularly the Abbey of Cluny, manuscript studies, music in the Iberian Peninsula, music in childhood, and the intersections of music and the visual arts. Susan has published 7 books, the first, Shaping a Monastic Identity, Liturgy and History at the Imperial Abbey of Farfa. It won the Lewis Lockwood Award of the American Musicological Society. Her second monograph, Silent Music, Medieval Song, and the Construction of History in 18th Century Spain, won the Society's Robert M. Stevenson Award. Professor Boynton also co-edited with Diane Riley, The Practice of the Bible in the Middle Ages, and also co-edited with Diane Riley, Resounding Images, Medieval Intersections of Art, Music, and Sound, and that won the American Musicological Society's Ruth A. Soley Award. Susan's also co-edited multiple volumes, including From Dead of the Night to the End of the Day with Isabel Koshilin, and Musical Childhoods and Musical Cultures of Youth with Roman Koch, and Young Choristers, 650 to 1700 with Eric Rice. Without further ado, I introduce Professor Susan Boynton.
Thank you very much. And it is nice to be with people I've known a long time. I was on the search committee that hired Giuseppe Giardino, and actually, great choice. And I actually just wanted to say, even before I start my prepared text, that the very first person I actually met the first time I went to Toledo Cathedral Archives, which is a very, very long time ago, I think it was 2002, January 2002, was Michael Noon. And he's been there for me ever since. So it's just great. So I want to thank Lindsay Schramm, the Heyman Center, and the Arts and Sciences for this event. And I want to thank my colleagues for joining me here. Seth Kimmel has also been incredibly important in the formation of this book. So I could go on and on and on, but I have 8 minutes, so I'm going to get right started with my remarks. So Liturgy of Empire came out of a question that remained from my 2011 book, Silent Music, namely why a French diplomat in the 1740s knew about and asked to see medieval liturgical manuscripts in Toledo that were both inaccessible and obscure. And the answer I found is that the editions based on these manuscripts were avidly collected in 18th century France, particularly in Paris. Their interest as historical objects was augmented by the mechanisms of the rare book trade, and collecting was a pathway that spread ideas about some Iberian social and religious identities in the early modern period. Liturgy of Empire approaches the early modern reception of the Mozarabic rite through the study of print culture, memory, provenance, and historiography. So strictly speaking, what is the Mozarabic rite? You may be asking yourself. So strictly speaking, the Mozarabic rite was the Latin liturgy of Christians living under Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula between 711 and the end of the 11th century. And the art historians here know that the word is used much more capaciously than that quite often. So the word Mozarab, which comes from Arabic, means loosely Arabized, but the most common etymology that was known in the early modern period was a false one, derived from medieval Latin, mixti Arabes, which perhaps meant mixed with Arabs or mixed Arabs. And the question of what it meant is, of course, part of my book. So in the second chapter, I address the early modern fascination with the Mozarabs of Toledo, a distinct social group claiming a Visigothic heritage, special status, and tax exemptions that were frequently challenged in court. The rite is also known as Visigothic because of the period in which it originated, but it's more accurately called Old Hispanic. So all of these terms, Mozarabic, Visigothic, and Hispanic, evoke layered contexts in the history of the peninsula that have shaped the perception of its liturgy. The subtitle of my book, Reading the Mozarabic Rite, refers to the creation of diverse meanings through reception, and particularly through the circulation of the rite's published texts over the centuries after 1500 in much of Western Europe. Now, before that time, in late medieval Toledo, the Mozarabic community had dwindled, and the liturgy that it observed traditionally had declined. And this was because the Roman rite had been established in the cathedral, the newly founded cathedral of Toledo, after the city was captured by Christian forces under Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085. So at the end of the 15th century, realizing this, Archbishop Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, soon after arriving in Toledo, decided to appropriate the powerful symbolism, or what he understood ingeniously to be the powerful symbolism of the Mozarabic rite, and to showcase his own patronage by endowing a chapel in Toledo Cathedral for the celebration of that rite. A decade later, he then commissioned for the decoration of the chapel what you see here, a monumental wall painting of the conquest of Oran. North Africa, which Cisneros himself financed and led in 1509. The expedition was part of a crusading effort undertaken in collaboration with the Catholic monarchs with the eschatological intent of converting the entire Mediterranean to Christianity and crowning King Ferdinand as King of Jerusalem. So one reason for my title, Liturgy of Empire, is that Cisneros promoted the Rite in Toledo very much in parallel with his support for Spanish expansion in the Mediterranean. And the triumphal entry, which here is very small, but it's on the right, the triumphal entry of Cisneros into Oran was the backdrop for services in the chapel. And the celebration of the Mozarabic Rite was thus visibly, and it was frequently remarked upon that it was visibly a performance of imperial aspirations furthered through North African campaigns, and it underlined the Archbishop's dual identity as a learned churchman and as a military man. These two facets of his persona were emphasized also in the poetic paratexts that framed his biography in copies that were owned in every important library in Western Europe in the early modern period. Moreover, the printed version of the Rite that he fostered spread across Europe concurrently with the growth of Spain's global empire, and many copies moved within diplomatic networks. I'm trying to advance the slide. Oh, we got it. Oh, it was just too fast. That's all. Okay. So he commissioned the first editions of the Rite, an updated version of the medieval texts, which is the subject of my first chapter. And these texts had been inaccessible, both because the manuscripts were few and dilapidated, and because the Visigothic script they were written in was considered illegible. And this is a trope throughout the early modern period. So while the primary purpose of these editions was to make their texts available in a form corrected according to Renaissance standards, these books as objects had a singular role in the book trade through the 20th century because of their high price and their scarcity, but starting already to stand out in the book trade in the 16th century. The annotations in the copies bear witness, furthermore, to the responses of those who used the editions for various purposes, and also those who drew upon them as historical sources. Now, in 2018, I set out to investigate the provenance of the 67 extant copies, which are preserved in 30 different libraries. And using notes of possession and other evidence, I found that diplomats and other lay elites began acquiring these books in the early 16th century. Oh, sorry, I went past my slide, which we don't really have time for anyway, about the reasons for commissioning the editions. A copy of the Missal was purchased in January 1531 by an aristocrat from southern France, Honoré de Ponteves, the Lord of Flasson in Provence. And he was received as a hospitaller at Malta the following year. A copy of the breviary was inscribed in 1567 by the Austrian Habsburg diplomat Adam von Dietrichstein, who had married a Spanish lady-in-waiting descended from Ferdinand III, Maria Folch de Cardona. In that year, Adam entered the order of Calatrava with a level of privilege usually accessible only to the members of the highest Spanish aristocracy. In addition to the 16th century owners, who were members of the military orders, which at this time both espoused an anti-Muslim ideology and were reserved for the nobility increasingly, I traced the story of many other owners and their copies in the 17th through the 20th centuries. So the Mozarabic editions were objects of desire among 18th century bibliophiles. And the description in the first volume of the influential 1763 Bibliographie Instructive was widely cited by everyone who was interested in rare books in the second half of the 18th century and the 19th century, including in these notes in a copy owned by the important collectors d'Argenson and Paulmy, whose collection is at the origins of the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal. So the circulation of the editions shaped a widespread understanding of the Rite as an emblem of Christian Spain. Discussions of the Rite appear in the correspondence of Leibniz and in the world history written by Voltaire. The editions commissioned by Cisneros also facilitated historical research on the liturgy, and I argue in my final chapter that they mark the first time that liturgical texts were published as a philological project of textual archaeology, and that this intervention initiated the study of the liturgy as a historical object in 1500. In addition to the commentary tradition, I draw on thousands of annotations in the copies that I've studied of the editions, some of which illustrate early modern controversies regarding the veneration of saints in the Iberian Peninsula and are specific also to Toledo. So to conclude, the reception of the Mozarabic Rite was shaped not only by diverse forms of commemoration, but also by readers and owners and scholars. Consumers of the editions took part, along with the Mozarabs of Toledo, in a cumulative, multi-sided articulation of the rite's meaning over centuries. In addition to the formation of ideas about the Mozarabic Rite and about the history of Spain, my book also describes interactions among people and the ways that they enacted their relationship to the past. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite Professor Reno to talk.
Thank you. Sorry, maybe I was too close. Can you hear me? Great, thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations, Susan. This is, I have to say, quite an achievement. And I'm not a specialist of Spanish music and history, but I have to say there is a level of erudition and clarity in this book that is striking. And I must say, I really learned a lot from this book. So as I said, I'm not a specialist in this field, but I do want to highlight what was for me, some of the revelations as I was reading this book. And Susan mentioned the reception history of a Mozarabic Rite. But this reception history in the book is really a fascinating mosaic of several different histories. And there is a linguistic history, material history, political history, religious history, musical history. And as these histories come together, you really get a sense of how we can explain how and why Mozarabic liturgy and chant became a national symbol tied to Spanish identity and politics. And it's a fascinating picture to see all these histories coming together. To me, one of the surprising discoveries in this journey towards the creation of this national symbol of Spanish identity and politics is the amount of scholarly labor that it took to create such a symbol. The amount of a humanistic scholarship, for example, that went into the study of the manuscripts, the liturgical tradition, the history. And I have to say, since we're talking a little bit here about a nation building, I have to say, if I may digress for a moment, that as I was reading the book, Virgil's Aeneid came to my mind. And at the very beginning, and so we learned about Aeneas and why Juno is so angry with Aeneas, what are her motivations. We get this line 50, when Virgil says, it was so hard to found the nation of Rome. And here you get this sense it was so hard to found the Spanish Empire, and the amount of scholarship. Of course, from this point of view, this kind of scholarship takes up a whole, different meaning, which for me, again, was very much a revelation, especially after, the kind of scholarship that went into the study of this tradition after the publication of the Ortiz editions. And of course, as Susan mentioned, how the research itself on this Mozarabic Rite, it was intertwined with the expansion of the Spanish Empire and the consolidation of the monarchy, of the Hispanic monarchy. Now, there are fascinating insights for somebody like me who works in the 16th century. There are fascinating insights into the application of humanistic philology to liturgical texts prior to the Council of Trent. And for those of you who have not read the book yet, there is even some forgery there's a great section of forgeries and how there is this hymn that became central to a controversy led by a Jesuit historian, Jeronimo Román de la Higuera. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And falsifying, he claimed falsely that Saint Tirsus was actually from Toledo. There's a wonderful, actually, little section on this forgery. Highly recommended, I have to say. It's a lot of historical forgeries, and this is a great one. And the kind of debated and on, partly because of the term in Latin that was misinterpreted. And as Susan actually says memorably, she says, well, aspiring historian, but not much of a Latinist. And I would say that I found, I can even give you the page number, page 179. Susan actually brings together some of these historical trends under the theoretical framework of some of the work that Aleida Asmana did actually on cultural memory. And there is this, I think, the fundamental takeaway from the book when Susan discusses how annotations, this kind of scholarship on the manuscripts, the physical annotations and controversies highlighted the iterative process of cultural memory. This idea that has to be maintained, and scholarship becomes on the manuscripts becomes a way of almost repeating this exercise in order to preserve this kind of cultural memory. And the book also shows how Mozarabic Rite is again linked to print culture, philology, as I said. And if you wonder how all of these come together beautifully in the book, I would again highly recommend chapter 3, which is the central chapter. And to me, it's very symmetrically constructed in a way. It's the central chapter in which you will find this analysis of the chapel of Corpus Christi that was built in the Cathedral of Toledo, and Susan mentioned this, with the frescoes, or painting, the fresco painting.
They're actually fascinatingly, it's Diane Baudard who pointed out to me that they're wall paintings. They're not frescoes. And she's in Toledo right now, following up on this material analysis. Diane Baudard on the art history department.
So to read the chapter immediately. And so these paintings are the depictions of the conquest of Oran. And of course, there is it's also the chapel, devoted to the performance of Mozarabic chant and liturgy. And I must say, Susan's analysis, so that space is striking, because on one side, you have the static representation of this historical event, and Cardinal Cisneros was instrumental as a promoter and of this military expedition. On the other side, you have, of course, the living performance of Mozarabic liturgy. And the way Susan describes how these two elements come together within this specific project in the 16th century is actually quite striking. I would say, if I were to use a modern term here, if Cisneros, had lived in these days, I think that would be like a sort of a multimedia installation. It's a sort of an archetypical multimedia installation in which you have the visual, the static quality of memorializing a historical event on one side, and on the other side, again, the living, the iterative performance of a Mozarabic chant in the same space. And I'm going to conclude here because, again, I don't want to take too much time. But it's really, for me, the way all this, as I said at the very beginning, the way these separate or different histories, so the way they come together in this project, that to me it's one of the most striking contributions of this book. And I would also say, when you read that chapter, it feels as if maybe Cardinal Cisneros or Susan have created this kind of memory capsule. And when you live inside this space, an entire world comes alive, actually, for us historically. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Now to Professor Seth Kimmel.
Congratulations. Congratulations, Susan, on a wonderful book. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be back here participating in this event series. Susan and I have been chatting about all things Mozarabic and Cisneros for many years now, often on very enjoyable walks around the neighborhood. So it's nice to see the book actually come out and be able to hold it and read it in person. I take it that one of the reasons I'm here at this table is because I'm the Hispanist. I'm not from the music department. I'm embarrassed to say I know very little about music, but lucky for me, there's actually not that much music in this book. So I feel like this actually is sort of my bread and butter. And I really felt right at home reading this book. Many of the main characters really, they feel like old friends, even though they're not the nicest of guys in other contexts. They're people that I've come to know in my own research, but seen through Susan's lens, and with a bit of disciplinary distance and her own, strategies of discernment, they somehow look different to me. So, for example, Cisneros for Susan is connected to Toledo and Oran, but the Cisneros that I know is more connected to Granada, where he took over as second Archbishop of the reconquered city. And he installed a kind of more combative and violent approach to the process of assimilating the Muslims there. So seen from Susan's perspective, that looks more like practice for what comes later, and I can see sort of the later story of how that experience in Granada shaped the way he thought about and wrote about Oran, for example. It was a kind of testing ground, I think, for the main event, which is what I think Susan's writing about. More generally, I had never really considered Cisneros' efforts at self-fashioning, which is an important concept, a Renaissance, borrowed from Stephen Greenblatt, I guess, so the idea of self-fashioning. And Susan really paints Cisneros in this way, in a really thoughtful and fascinating way in the early chapters of the book. For Cisneros, this recuperation of the Rite and the addition of the Rite and the support of the whole project was personal in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. He was crafting his own professional reputation around the Rite, around the conquest of Oran. Even though Susan reminds us that the conquest of Oran is celebrated, there's epic poetry and there's all sorts of materials about the conquest of Oran, but actually it was pre-negotiated, and Cisneros showed up late and just kind of sauntered in. So the self-fashioning of Oran is really interesting, and it's a whole process of imagination there. And it involves this mixing of the history of Oran with the actual space of the chapel in the Cathedral of Toledo, where the two things are very much intermingled. I think that Cisneros' intuition was that these two features of Spanish history would be very useful tools of identity formation, even beyond his own personal identity, that they would serve this kind of imperial apologetics. That I think was his intuition, and he was right. So it's out of that early 16th century moment that the mythology of reconquest, like this easy story that we tell about Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, it hardened into something like ideology. Like it has shaped Spanish history all the way up, through Franco and beyond. It's also the moment, and this is where Susan, I think, is particularly sharp, where you have this fiction of continuity, is what she calls it, between pre-Islamic Visigothic forms of Christian practice and early modern Iberian Christian identity. So again, that connection there is a product of Cisneros's work. So fiction of continuity, it's your turn. No, but I'm curious to know whether you think Cisneros or Ortiz would really disagree. So, the project is not to unveil, the project of Liturgy of Empire is not to unveil some kind of hidden manipulation of the liturgical text. No, we're looking over their shoulders as they're correcting, they're revising, but not in some kind of malicious or manipulative way. It's a process that they're very open about. And so they might not use the language of fiction of continuity, but they have their parallel ways of thinking about it. And that I think is interesting. I think also implicit in the idea, not necessarily the title, but the idea of Liturgy of Empire is the sense that what began as a visual program in a single chapel in the Cathedral of Toledo, or an edition of an old liturgical manuscript, can be easily scaled up to some bigger story. So the fiction of continuity, this continuity between pre-Islamic Christian community and practice on the Iberian Peninsula and what's going on in the 16th century, it served Cisneros well for the reasons I've already described, and it served Mozarabic parishioners well. They were trying to escape paying certain taxes that if they're associated with the Mozarabic community, they pay other taxes, but not those taxes. And so there were material concerns at the beginning, but they quickly grew into something bigger and more generalized. And that's what I mean by scaling up. And so you can see how that desire to imagine a close connection to a Christian past was very useful in Toledo, but at the same time, in other regions of Spain, there were communities of people in different contexts doing the same thing. In Granada, there was a great desire to, in part through the kind of forgeries that Giuseppe loves, trying to solidify and imagine this connection to the Islamic, to the Christian past that predated the Islamic period. And so you can see how that clicks for people and scholars even outside of Toledo who are interested in similar questions. So I think this is why so many Spanish historians of the period, with or without any direct connection to Toledo, were weighing in on the etymology of the word Mozarabic, or they retell the story, the great story of the trial by fire and the duel between the Mozarabic Rite and the Roman Rite, battling it out to decide who's gonna come out on top. So lots of Spanish historians are intervening because it's useful for them too in their own contexts. I think another thing that's interesting is that Susan is tracing the relevance and debates about the Mozarabes through print culture, right? And so if you're telling a story about the medieval period, but you're drawing on print culture, that strikes me there's something a little strange or off about that. The importance of print culture it's something that is really important to Susan and her research here. And it signals, I think, that you see the chronology of the book is 1500 to 1800, and we're telling the story is an early modern story. It's how the early moderns invented the medieval period for their own particular ends. And so it's not just that these printed editions are stand-ins or reinventions of some medieval past. It's that they're metaphors for Spain and Spanish Empire in the present, in the early modern present and beyond. But so just zooming out even a little bit more, I think even for all the serious Spanish scholars that Susan cites and that are interested in all things Mozarabic, there's something a little bit embarrassing or uncomfortable about this taint of being mixed in with the Arabs or being Arabized. I'm not sure the difference between Arabizing and mixed up with the Arabs, but I mean maybe that's something else to talk about afterwards. The names are a mouthful, so I won't repeat them all. But again, more of my old buddies who are these early modern historians who are citing Arabic sources and even citing Hebrew sources and trying to figure out this old Christian, this medieval Christian past. But I think it's telling that they're having to draw on this range of sources in order to do that. In order to tell this story about purity and continuity, they're drawing on all of these sources from other communities and religious traditions. And it's kind of, it reveals the lie, right? I mean, you can't tell the story about Christian purity without all these sources because they were mixed up. And so it's a story about Iberian Christian discontinuity, almost despite their best efforts. So, and that's within Spain. Outside Spain, this story of discontinuity is a kind of useful polemical tool. There's the modern Spanish tourist slogan that says, recently at least, that Spain was different, right? Go to Spain is different. Well, it's different because it was all mixed up. And that's why people go, you go on these tours of Andalusia because it's different than the rest of Europe. And that may be a selling point now, but it was kind of embarrassing. And it was a point of polemic for that period that Susan's looking at. For Erasmus, Spain was different. It was a euphemism for a Semitic past. Like over in Spain, they're basically Jews. And that's why he didn't want to go there. So that, the difference between what's, the sense of that difference within the peninsula and the sense of that difference outside the peninsula serve different ideological and political ends in very interesting ways. And so now I'm coming to my conclusion. I just want to say that one of the great strengths of this book is that it takes these very familiar tropes and refracts them through the liturgical lens. And of course, not just anybody can do this. We've seen Susan's long CV, but let me just detail some of the kinds of skills you need to be able to successfully undertake a book like this. You have to be able to follow all the various debates about the calendar, about when the correct feast day was of this or that early medieval saint. You've got to know how to read a painting in relationship to the sacred space in which it's found. You've got to know something about contemporary debates about memory studies. You've got to have a clear sense for what the contraction of the verb in the perfect tense of classical Latin ought to be when you see the mistake. And you've got to travel all over Europe to track down printed books and manuscripts, and then have the paleo. It's not just all fun and games. You've got to have the paleographic and codicological skills to make sense of the artifacts and their annotations. So I think it's fair to say that in order to write this book, you've got to be Susan Boynton. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Seth. And now to Professor Michael Noon.
Of the diverting and important scrutiny which the curate and the barber made in the library of our ingenious gentleman. He was still sleeping, so the curate asked the niece for the keys of the room where the books, the authors of all the mischief were, and right willingly she gave them. They all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 volumes of books, very well bound. The moment the housekeeper saw them, she turned about and ran out of the room, and came back immediately with a saucer of holy water and the sprinkler, saying, "Here, your worship, Signor Licentiate, sprinkle this room. Don't leave any magician of the many there are in these books to bewitch us in revenge for our designs of banishing them from the world." The simplicity of the housekeeper made the licentiate laugh, and he directed the barber to give him the books one by one to see what they were about, as there might be some to be found among them that did not deserve the penalty of fire. "No," said the niece, "there's no reason for showing mercy to any of them. They have every one of them done mischief. Better fling them out of the window into the court and make a pile of them and set fire to them. Or else carry them into the yard, and there a fire can be made without the smoke giving any annoyance." The housekeeper said the same. So eager were they both for the slaughter of those innocents. But the curate would not agree to it without first reading at least the titles. The first that Master Nicholas put into his hand was the 4 books of Amadis of Gaul. "This seems a mysterious thing," said the curate, "for as I have heard say, this was the first book of chivalry printed in Spain. And from this, all the others derive their birth and origin. So it seems to me that we ought inexorably to condemn it to the flames as the founder of so vile a sect. Nay, sir, said the barber, I too have heard that this is the best of all the books of this kind that have been written, and so, as something singular in its line, it ought to be pardoned. True, said the curate, and for that reason, let its life be spared for the present. Let us see that other which is next to it. It is, said the barber, the Sergas of Vesplandian, the lawful son of Amadis of Gaul. Then verily, said the curate, the merit of the father must not be put down to the account of the son. Take it, mistress housekeeper, and fall into the yard, and lay the foundation of the pile for the bonfire we're about to make. The housekeeper obeyed with great satisfaction, and the Esplandian flung to the yard to await with all patience the fire that was in store for him. Proceed, said the curate. This that comes next, said the barber, is Amadis of Greece. Indeed, I believe all those on this side are of the same Amadis lineage. Then to the yard with the whole of them, said the curate, for to have the burning of Queen Pitiquinestra and the shepherd Daruel and his eclogues and the bedevilled and involved discourses of his author, I would burn with them the father who begot me if I were going about in the guise of a knight errant. I'm of the same mind, said the barber, and so am I, added the niece. In that case, said the housekeeper, here, into the yard with them. They were handed to her, and as there were many of them, she spared herself the staircase and flung them down out of the window. Who is that tub there? Said the curate. This, said the barber, is Don Orlante. The author of that book, said the curate, was the same that wrote The Garden of Flowers. And truly, there is no deciding which of the two books is the more truthful, or, to put it better, the less lying. All I can say is, send this one to the yard for a swaggering fool. Well, as Professor Boynton reminds us when she recounts the anecdote from the 12th century chronicle of Nájera, in which books containing both the Roman Rite and the Mozarabic Rite were hurled into the bonfire in 1077, there is reprieve for both books, and of course the rites that they transmitted. As ever with Cervantes, there are plenty of threads that pick up in one way or another those that concern us right now. He evokes authors, he evokes books about books, he evokes the dangerous ideas that they might contain. Books that deserve the penalty of burning and those that deserve reprieve. I first went to live in Toledo in 1981. I lived there for about a year in 1981. I returned in 1999 to live for 3 consecutive years, and each day of those 3 years I spent working in the archives of Toledo Cathedral. One of the great joys is that distinguished scholars from far over the ocean would come into the Toledo Cathedral archive, and that was where I first met Susan. So you're right, it was 2002. I've always been fascinated by the Mozarabic chapel, by the Mozarabic Rite, but I'd never actually studied the old Hispanic Rite. And for a while there, I thought that I was going to learn about it from you. Indeed, I found and learnt about it much more than I ever thought could possibly be learned about it. In 1501, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, the statesman and reforming Archbishop of Toledo, ordered the foundation and endowment of the splendidly decorated chapel, which you did a moment ago see up there, but it's certainly on the cover of the book. Although construction was to last a quarter of a century, and the chapel was not concentrated until 1511, celebration of the Mozarabic Rite began in 1502 in the chapel situated off the cloister. Cisneros appointed a commission, as we've seen the title pages up on the screen, to publish new editions of the Mozarabic Missal in 1500 and the Breviary in 1502. And between 1502 and 1508, the copying of 4 choir books, cantorales, that would contain almost 400 monophonic chants for the Mass and for the office. We could talk a lot about the editorial process that went into what I maintain is the complete invention of these 400 chants, but that's part of this long story. In 1749, Spain's second Bourbon monarch, Ferdinand VI, founded the Royal Commission on the Archives, and the Jesuit polymath Andrés Marcos Burriel was appointed the director. The Royal Commission's primary objectives were clear and political. They were to locate and transcribe documents in ecclesiastical archives that would strengthen royal control, the so-called patronato real, over ecclesiastical benefices and property at a time of continuing negotiations with the Vatican. Since the 16th century, the patronato real had allowed Spanish monarchs to appoint bishops without regard to the curia's wishes. And the original documents turned up by the Royal Commission would demonstrate the antiquity of the Spanish monarchy's aims. Yet these objectives were an expression of a larger and more subtle project that would anchor the Bourbon dynasty's claims to legitimacy in a trans-historical Hispanismo. Burriel's role in this larger vision was explicitly laid out in a letter addressed to the Dean and Chapter of Toledo Cathedral by the Secretary of State José de Carvajal y Lancaster. While Burriel's brief was described as nothing less than the construction of a new ecclesiastical history of Spain, the Mozarabic Rite was only mentioned as a footnote in Carvajal's letter of introduction. In the course of her investigations, Susan became fascinated with the tension between Burriel's desire, on the one hand, to understand the diversity of Spanish liturgical practice through close scrutiny of the sources, and, on the other, to affirm the continuity of an essential Spanishness, essential Christianity and essential Catholicism. And in her splendid monograph of 2011, splendidly titled Silent Music, I don't know why somebody hadn't got that title before, but you were very quick to pick it up. You should have made a website of silentmusic.com before somebody else does. Well, she sharpened her focus on Burriel and his comparative method and his historiographical practice. It must have been this determined effort to understand the multiple layers of the use and reception of the neo-Mozarabic rite that led to this wonderful new study that helps us understand how that rite functioned as a cultural symbol. It's a hugely important contribution to the study of liturgy, and I think that it's one to which Cervantes' curate, his barber, and his mistress housekeeper would have granted a well-deserved reprieve. It won't be burnt, not even in 2025, where books are being burned in the United States. It's something that I would be treasuring for decades. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thank you, Michael. And now I hand it back to Susan to respond.
Yes, I see, because we have a very useful outline of the event, which includes me responding to the panels. I don't know if I'll respond to each of them separately or just a few things, kind of pulling together a few points. First of all, thank you very much to everybody for these very useful points. And yeah, I mean, the book, and it's interesting because I didn't actually say this, and Giuseppe Gerbino said it, which complemented perfectly what I said. The book is about the formation of a national identity. And part of the reason I don't jump right out and say that is there has been something of a debate. There's even a scholar in Spain who published an article kind of in disagreement with my work long before this book came out, making the point that the Mozarabic rite in the 16th century was not yet viewed as a symbol of national identity. This is Pilar Ramos, and she felt very strongly that one needs to distinguish what happens in the 16th century, the understanding of it locally, even by foreign visitors in the 16th century, from the way it becomes understood in the 17th and 18th century. So I think it's important to think about that idea of the building and Cisneros saw himself as Aeneas. I mentioned that in the, was like a new Aeneas. Going to North Africa, he considered himself to be a new Aeneas, and people compared him to Aeneas. So for a very different kind of foundation. So the idea of this difficult nation building in what is really a very hybrid context. And I think the mixity that Seth was talking about, this question of being mixed up and mixed, I think this is part of what made people uncomfortable, was this false etymology, mixti Arabes, which doesn't really mean, what does it mean? What does it really mean? And the fact that the culture and the use of Arabic of the Mozarabs in the Islamic period was very remote by the early modern period. So I think there was also a problem of memory, of kind of understanding or trying to reconstruct what might have been an earlier phase in the cultural identity and the profile of this population, which by that point was, I mean, I don't want to use a kind of an anachronistic term, but I would say assimilated, in the sense that they were essentially Castilians who were claiming a certain kind of difference. But the kind of difference they were claiming was largely based on the fact that the Mozarabic rite, the liturgy, was their main identifying characteristic. Language was not their identifying characteristic, their names, or their claims of heritage. But the reason that the liturgy is so important in so many different discussions, whether they are written by authors in Spain or authors in other countries, the reason the liturgy becomes such a focal point is that it was, in fact, almost the sole identifying characteristic left that the Mozarabs could say made them Mozarabs. And then there are fascinating ways in which the parishes, so the parishes are also related to the liturgy, the parish boundaries then define who the Mozarabs are. They could live in one parish but claim affiliation with a different parish. And this is part of a project I'm going to continue working on. I only touched upon it in the book. But the whole question of the definition of the parishes, which continues to be controversial in the 18th century, and it's related to the issue that Seth mentioned, that is taxation. They're different forms of tithing. It is a fascinating one, is the whole question of what is a parishioner and what is a parish? What makes a parish? It's also important, this idea of the fiction of continuity. It's a very significant concept, because the 6 Mozarabic parishes that are constantly cited in all of the discussions of the history of the Mozarabs apparently did not exist, or are not known to have existed, before the 12th century, but they're used as a retrospective identifier of Mozarabic identity, as if they had existed, if not since the Visigothic period, certainly during the Islamic period. But church historians have shown in recent decades that, in fact, these parishes, probably many of the Mozarabs who were in Toledo in the 12th and 13th centuries, had come from further south. They weren't from Toledo at all. So Toledo, the Toledan Mozarabic population at the time of this conquest of 1085 was probably very, very small. And that even the continuity of the rite may have been simply ensured by people who came from other places, from Andalusia, who were not from Toledo. So even the medieval fiction of continuity is highly problematic. It's highly debated. And so Cisneros would not have known this, but I do think that Seth is bringing up something really important, the idea that Cisneros knew exactly what he was doing. I'm sure he knew very well that there were hardly any Mozarabs in Toledo in the end of the 15th century, or anyone who could meaningfully be defined as Mozarab. He knew this because also Isabella and Ferdinand had made attempts that are documented to shore up Mozarabic practice. There was at one point they wanted to keep Mozarabs from moving out of the parishes and others from moving in. They wanted to pay clergy to be trained to perform the rite. So there was an awareness in the 15th century, which is well known, that it was really a dying tradition. And Cisneros was prescient in thinking, what would be not the stakes, but what would be the advantages of consolidating this tradition, and a tradition that was sort of falling apart at the seams and ragged in the parishes. Well, if he put it into the cathedral and endowed it, it would never again be falling apart at the seams. It would be guaranteed, and it continues today. So I think he knew very well there was a productive fiction of continuity, and Ortiz I mean, one thing we didn't mention here is the way the editions changed the liturgy. It's not quite the same as the melodies that Michael Neen was referring to, which are in fact largely invented melodies in the choir books, but the editions bring in a lot of the Roman Rite. I mean, the editions are in a way, just to make it a very kind of a crude generalization, the editions are almost an admission that the Mozarabic Rite no longer was, truly in use, because the editions add so much and they contextualize so much, they change so much, they almost are like a way of illustrating the fact that this rite had to be reinvented. And the last thing I'll say, because I don't know how long I've been talking, I don't want to go on too long, but part of the reason all of this was so convenient in a way, and would not have happened in France and would not have happened in Italy, was the Visigothic script. The Visigothic script at this time and through the early modern period, I mean, was viewed as illegible. People couldn't read it. So although it's a trope made by other in other contexts of publishing editions of the liturgy, that the old manuscripts are illegible, so we need to publish a new edition, and then that edition will become the official version. Although it's a trope elsewhere, in the Iberian Peninsula, it's in fact true that people couldn't read the manuscripts. And the editions also show how much trouble people had reading, because even when they're clearly trying to transcribe faithfully the text in the manuscripts, there are certain mistakes that are made simply because they didn't recognize the form of letters in the Visigothic script in every case. So the extreme importance of print culture in this whole history that I write about is partly because print culture was the way in which information was getting out and about, but also because the manuscripts were kind of non-functional in that context. And so it's a very, in that way, it's a very particularly kind of Iberian history. The reason that the manuscripts of the Mozarabic Rite are in Visigothic script, that is hard to read, is because the Visigothic Rite, or the Old Hispanic Rite, was essentially suppressed in the Middle Ages, and it was replaced with the Roman Rite. And this, again, is very particular to the Iberian Peninsula. So the manuscripts, if there had been a more continuity, it would have meant that there was a larger copying of the liturgical texts in later scripts that would have been more accessible to a wider variety of people. And that's what didn't happen. So there's a kind of a narrowing that occurred, and the insight, the intuition of Cisneros was not just how to take advantage of it. I don't mean in a calculating sense, but what kind of big creative gesture can one make in a situation where one can intervene and in effect reinvent an aspect of this very important long tradition and this early culture. And one last thing I wanted to say in response to something that I think that it was what Seth was saying, was that the glorification of the conquest of Oran in the fresco, in the chapel, and then in print culture all around the chapel and around Cisneros, his life and so on, it was very convenient, because something Michael pointed out to me some time ago was Cisneros was extremely unpopular. His chapter hated him. He arrived in Toledo, and the first thing he did was, we're going to reform the chapter. They have concubines. We're going to we're going to reform. Everybody's going to. So he came in, and they hated him. They wanted to get rid of him. They did everything they could to get rid of him. And so the conquest of Oran was financed by the archdiocese. He used the money of the cathedral's own coffers to pay for this, in exchange for which Oran would be under the Archdiocese of Toledo. So it was all the more important to justify vividly the importance and the kind of global, you might even say global importance of that conquest, which he did in the chapel with this extraordinary commission. And that was, again, a very calculated decision, in terms of representation. That was very, as Seth pointed out, a very successful one. So that's all I'll say in response for now.
Thank you, Susan. We have some time for questions from all of you. If anybody has any questions, if you do, okay, great. Yeah, speak into the mic.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to congratulate you all. And I also wanted to make sure everybody knew this book was available on open access from Brill. You can just download it.
It is. I should have done a QR code on the screen so people could just flash it. I didn't think of that until just now.
Well, certainly this book is obviously well worth reading. Thank you very much. It's also really very stimulating. So I find it, I have three small questions, if you'll allow me, Susan. The first one has to do with languages. So there were Christians in Toledo after the conquest, Islamic conquest. They never had access to Latin.
Well, the liturgy you're talking about after 711.
Right.
So the liturgy, the Mozarabic rite was in Latin.
So you say the manuscripts are in Visigothic script.
Yes.
Yes, but they never translated their Latin into Latin paleography.
To Caroline.
Yes, right.
That is an interesting point because in fact, there are another thing that is a can of worms truly in this field, and which I would like to continue working on, is that there are controversies about the dating of these liturgical manuscripts. There have been for a long time, since the middle of the 20th century, but one of them is now viewed just dating to be a 13th century manuscript in Visigothic script. So there's a tradition of continuing to use the Visigothic script even into the late 11th century, 12th century, even into the 13th century. And so the chant, and now there are, different, I'm really focused on Toledo, but the chant in Toledo of this particular liturgical tradition was never, the melodies were never put into staff notation. They were never put into a notation that we could now recover and read the melodies from. And the script of their chant manuscripts remains the Visigothic script.
Fascinating.
Yes, and then the thing about the languages is that they were, presumed, again, this population about which rather little is known in the period, like the whole 10th century and the early 11th, but they're presumed to all have become Arabized, to have spoken Arabic.
So that was my second brief question. Do we have evidence of Muslim conversions to Christianity? And that might explain in a way the name, because it has a kind of an ethnic or even racial connotation mixed, which of course can apply to cultural assimilation. But is there evidence of Muslim conversions to Christianity that would then explain why these parishes remain discriminated against? I know there's a fiscal dimension, but I just wonder, it's out of ignorance, this question.
That period, later, the first conversions for that period, I don't know. I think what we tend to have much more of is there's a large documentary corpus, and the linguistic question, when I said presumed, what I was really saying was the linguistic evidence tends to be that there are, which I describe a little bit in the book, but it's not at all my field, that there are many archival, there are many notarial documents of the Christian population in Arabic in the 12th century, in Arabic in the 13th century, and then in the 13th century in Arabic and Castilian and Latin, and then eventually only in Castilian and Latin, and then at some point in between there are Arabic signatures, but the documents are not primarily. So that's not an answer to your question about conversion. But I think, I think that there's more of a sense that there was a difficulty distinguishing between the use of language and influence. I mean, there's also a very, very large literature, which is not my own research, but there's a very large literature on the influence of Islam on Christians in the Islamic Iberian Peninsula. And that's kind of Thomas Berman, for instance, that's like intellectual history. But I don't know to what extent he's dealing really with conversion, or more just what are people reading? What do they know? What are they thinking? How are they recasting theological ideas through the influence that they have by living in an Islamic environment? And then there were long controversies from the Carolingian period onward. I don't remember if they're before that, about heresy, about the Hispanic rite itself, adoptionism, and whether these ideas are related to Islam. But of course, that's not the same as conversion. That's more kind of
Yes.
inter-religious dialogue and intellectual contact.
Yes. And last one, very quickly, I'm fascinated by the tension between imposing a Roman rite after the conquest of Granada and Toledo, and also claiming continuity by maintaining this kind of marginal form of Christianity. I just don't get it. Building an empire, but propagating in a way this Spanish Christianity, and yet making room for a marginal Christian group after having, stamped out the Jews and the Muslims from Spain. So that's just
and then the imposition of the Roman rite. That the Roman rite becomes the main form of worship, and so it's very. It's that. Well, that's kind of like why it's fascinating. Yeah.
Any more questions or comments?
Hi. Thank you, Susan. I have a follow-up to Professor's question. And if we go back to the old Spanish rite, so if we think in terms of the 8th century, the way that it developed, it must have developed under adoptionism, like we discussed. And yet, when we go back to the old Spanish rite, we never think about the heresy. Do you think it was apparent in the 16th century to them when they revised it? Did they think about aspects of heresy?
So this is an excellent question, because my understanding, and this is a field that I've read a bit about, but I can't pretend to be really an expert in this, that the accusations of adoptionism, that Cavadini and then other scholars who've written about the problem of adoptionism in the Old Hispanic Rite. So Cavadini's argument, and I don't remember the other ones after him, but he's the foundational one. It's called the last Christology of the West.
Yeah.
That book came out a long time ago. So he's arguing that the perception of heresy in the Old Hispanic Rite is a misunderstanding of the way in which the Old Hispanic texts, again, in the Carolingian period, that Carolingian writers misunderstood the nature of the Augustinian theology in the Old Hispanic Rite, and that it was really that their Augustinianism really wasn't heretical, but that it was perceived as such by people like Alcuin, and that it was a problem of the Carolingian kind of the adoptionist controversy was really a result of Carolingian reception of this early theological tradition. So he was arguing it was not heretical. I have found that Buriel, who was this 18th century Jesuit I wrote about in my last book, he really became very interested in the questions of adoptionism, and he annotated and he wrote lots and lots of notes. I could give you lots of his unpublished notes about adoptionism.
Thank you.
He must have been getting this from writers on church history. In the 16th century, I don't think I encountered people, of course I didn't read everything, but I'm not sure I encountered writers focusing on adoptionism. I think it's actually for a very simple reason. I think that they didn't know the texts, because there's the first edition that's published in 1500, 1502, and yes, people read them, but they also had a kind of symbolic value. And what I noticed in the last chapter of my book, I had to read hundreds and hundreds and thousands of pages of Latin, ecclesiastical Latin commentaries of the 17th and 18th centuries. Very slowly did a real knowledge of the texts gradually accumulate. So in the 16th century, I think people didn't really know the texts. Yes, those who published the text knew them, but I don't know if enough people would have been able to read them closely. But it's a very good question. I would really have to go and look.
Thank you. Thanks.
I think I could imagine where to go look, but it's a very, very good question.
Anyone else?
I think the among the many appealing features of your book is the way it's shot through with all these ironies and paradoxes in every way. That, you know, the recovery of the past is actually its reinvention, or its complete its forgery in many ways, and that the way of and that there's this strange flip from a reconquista long in the past into an empire stretching into the future. It's particularly about that last flip that I would like to ask you, because there seems to me to be always a very clear distinction made in the minds of medieval writers between a defensive war where you're regaining your own territory and an offensive one, which, you know, apart from crusade, is very uncommon, and relatively uncommon, and it's certainly not the heroic kind of war. Whereas in the early modern period, these international wars and these wars of empire and expansion become much more common. And I just like you to comment on, if you can, how it is that you flip from one mindset into the other.
From the defensive into the offensive.
Yes, what is it that it enables and kind of justifies that move?
I mean, it could be, again, this idea of the fiction of continuity, of saying, you know, crusading is crusading is crusading is crusading, and saying, well, there are still Muslims in the Mediterranean, so we're not done, and we now must go. We have no choice but to go and conduct this sort of messianic new crusade, you know. But
the book shows how this Rite is actually spread throughout the Spanish New World.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think it has to do with maybe, I mean, this is a really hard question, obviously, to answer, but I think it has something to do with the idea of the Hispanic monarchy as becoming, I mean, I had to read a lot about, I was challenged about, what do you mean by empire? So I started reading a lot about theories of empire. And this idea that, you know, they use the word Hispanic monarchy, but they don't always use the word empire. And so the empire is the understanding that the Hispanic monarchy is multi-sided and universal. It's a universal monarchy. Well, if you have a universal monarchy, then you have to eradicate anything perceived as an obstruction of a universal monarchy, which is by definition a Christian monarchy. And, you know, there's been wonderful work, like this wonderful book by Andrew Dever, The Other Side of Empire, where he showed the relationship between the Mediterranean empire and the empire. And how, you know, with the Mediterranean Empire, I mean, the New World Empire financed the pursuit of the Mediterranean Empire. And of course, some of the plans that were made for the Mediterranean didn't come to fruition. Ferdinand died, you know, et cetera. Things happened that prevented this idea that they had, that they would actually go and Ferdinand would be crowned king of Jerusalem and the world would come to an end. And they actually thought this would happen. They had an eschatological ideology. But I do think that that perhaps it's that idea that there is a universal, that the Hispanic monarchy is universal, and it's sort of like almost a reflection of, you know, the idea of a world domination that exists in the mind and has to be reinforced. I don't know. I mean, I think Seth is very definitely the right person to answer your question, more than I am. Sorry, Seth.
Let's talk more about that over wine.
And I want to say one thing before even Chris says something, which is this book was very hard for me because I'm actually a medievalist. I spent a lot of my career in the 11th century. And so I never worked on print culture, never worked on provenance studies, and never worked on, and it's been fascinating. I didn't know what a cruzada is, a crusading bull. You know, you learn so many things. I just followed my nose and out of curiosity. But it's been a very humbling experience, I have to say. I mean, the early modern is a you know, very formidable field. Chris, you had a question.
Thank you very much. So I'm someone who's not read the book, so I'm only going off of what I've been listening to tonight. But I had a question, I suppose, that intersects with some of the themes that have been brought up in the questions, which is when I think of universal monarchy as an early modernist, I'm chiefly thinking of Charles V and his sort of rough contemporaneity with the Council of Trent, which again is a moment where we're seeing the church trying to sort of minimize the number of different rites. So I suppose it relates to this question of do you see the use of the Mozarabic rite sort of wax and wane over the period that you describe in your book?
Well, it depends on what you mean by use. I would say the instrumental use of it as a symbol, because when I was talking about the universal monarchy, I'm talking about a theory that's developing in the 17th century. And fascinatingly, one of the strongest, most extended expressions of it, which was written in the 17th century, actually wasn't published until the late 18th century, which I wrote about a little bit in my book. The idea of the universal Hispanic, monarchy, the Catholic monarchy. But anyway, the Mozarabic rite is also something very local in the early modern period. And the fact that it's performed in Toledo Cathedral in that chapel, it's actually was used as a form of display and a kind of form of not only a liturgical religious ritual display, but it was also a political display. And so there are treatises, one of the ones I cite from the 18th century that was printed, but there are sources that talk about how monarchs would be invited. And one of the things I publish in the book, which I transcribe, an unpublished source, they're asking for they're asking for the patronage real to be extended to the observance of the Mozarabic rite more explicitly. But anyway, monarchs were invited to, and others were invited to witness the performance, and so there was a way in which there was a political aspect to it, and I think that might have also followed some of this development of the different in the Bourbon, well, for the Habsburgs and then the Bourbon monarchs, their development of the power of the Hispanic monarchy and the articulation, the theorization of it, that was a powerful component of political thought, which I'm not a specialist, but as I said, I kind of tried to understand how one could trace this in parallel with the study of the Old Hispanic Rite, which Michael pointed out, in the 18th century happens, and also in a way with its performance in these particular contexts. Sorry, it's a long and perhaps a confused answer, but I tried.
Well, I would like to just close off this event by thanking the panelists and also thank Susan for writing such a wonderful book.